Snow came down like sifted ash that morning, pale and endless, burying every fence post and path until the world looked bleached of memory. Eliza May Carter moved through it like a ghost who refused to lie still. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, heavy with frost, and her breath came in sharp, white clouds. She carried wood to the door, one arm trembling from an old injury, the other braced against the wind that clawed across the ridge. Inside the cabin, the fire whispered small comforts, but she stayed outside longer than she needed to. Habit, maybe. Or penance. For 5 years, she had lived on that mountain alone. The house leaned against the wind, as though it had grown weary of waiting for laughter. A single chair sat beside the table. Her husband's boots remained by the hearth, dry and cracked, filled now with dust instead of footsteps. Every morning, she talked to him anyway, half whisper, half prayer, and sometimes caught herself smiling before she remembered he was gone. Down in town, people called her the widow in the hills. Children dared each other to ride past her gate. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she preferred the company of wolves. But none of them knew how love could turn to stone inside a body, how silence could become a kind of home. She had learned to measure the passing seasons by the sound of the roof beams, and the way the river below froze. In spring, she planted nothing. In summer, she hunted only when she had to. Autumn meant repairs, winter meant endurance. Always, she waited for something, though she could no longer say what. That morning, the world seemed emptier than usual. The storm had been building all night, a low, hungry growl that pressed against the windows. She rose before dawn to fetch water, but the well had frozen again. Her hands were cracked and red. She carried the bucket back inside, knowing there would be no thaw until March, if she lasted that long. Inside, she lit a lamp and sat by the fire, watching the flames bend and dance in the draft. She tried to sew, but her eyes blurred. Her father-in-law's old Bible lay on the shelf, unopened. She could still hear his voice reading from it the night before her husband left to bring food through a snowstorm, and never came back. They'd found him 3 days later, frozen beside the trail, the mule standing over him, half-starved. She had built her own grave out of that memory. Every day since, she'd chosen to keep breathing inside it. By mid-afternoon, the storm worsened. Snow pounded the roof like fists. Wind screamed through every crack. Eliza barred the door and prayed the chimney wouldn't clog. She set a pot of thin stew to warm and sat by the window, staring at the trees that bent beneath the white weight of sky. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard a sound, like a voice, low and muffled. She froze, listening. Nothing. Only the wind. When she finally rose to check the shutters, a dull thud echoed outside. Then another. Slow. Heavy. She gripped the poker from the hearth and opened the door a crack. Through the swirl of snow, a shape moved, huge, staggering. For a moment she thought it might be a bear, until it fell to one knee, and the outline of a man took form. He carried another body draped across his back, frail as a sack of grain. Eliza's breath caught. The man's hair was black and long, tangled with ice. His shoulders were bare beneath a wool blanket that had frozen stiff against him. The old man he carried looked half dead, his face gray, beard thick with frost. "Help!" the big one rasped, voice raw and strange. "Please." Eliza didn't move. Every warning she'd ever heard about Apaches flooded her mind. Raids, thefts, revenge. The town had filled her ears with fear for years, enough to grow roots. Yet this man knelt in her snow, head bowed, body shaking. She hesitated, torn between terror and mercy. "Go," she managed. "There's nothing for you here." He didn't lift his head. "Old one dying." He shifted, revealing the old man's face, and in the flicker of her lantern, she saw something she recognized. The lines of gentleness. The shape of a memory. "Eliza!" The whisper was faint, cracked with age. "Girl, you look just like her." Her throat went dry. She knew that voice. Abel Carter. Her husband's father. Before thought could catch up to feeling, she dropped the poker and stepped into the storm. Together, she and the stranger dragged Abel inside. The old man's weight was almost nothing. His lips were blue, his breath shallow. She wrapped him in blankets and pressed a hot cloth to his face. The stranger sank near the hearth, silent, his chest heaving. Steam rose from his skin. Eliza's hands shook as she poured water. She could not decide which frightened her more, the man's size or his stillness. "What happened?" she asked. "Found him near river," the Apache said. "He was walking. No horse. Fell." "You brought him all this way?" He nodded once. His gaze drifted to Abel, soft as snowfall. "He saved me. Long time ago. My turn now." The words unsettled her. Gratitude from an Apache? She wanted to believe it, yet the world she knew didn't make room for that kind of grace. Hours passed. The storm howled against the walls, testing every nail. She fed the fire until her eyes burned. Abel stirred once, muttering her husband's name. She answered softly, tears stinging her eyes. The stranger dozed, sitting upright, head bowed. She studied him under the dim light. Scars crossed his shoulder and ribs, pale lines against bronze skin. A warrior's marks, but there was no violence in his face. Only exhaustion. When he opened his eyes, they were dark and calm, like deep water. "You hate me," he said quietly. She flinched. "I don't know you." He nodded. "Same thing." The simplicity of it struck her like a slap. She looked away, ashamed. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed the world beyond the window. She moved through the small cabin, lighting candles, each flame a tiny defiance. The air smelled of pine smoke and fear. She cooked what little she had, half a loaf, a pot of stew barely thick enough to fill a bowl. When she set a plate before him, he hesitated, as if unworthy of the gift. Abel whispered, "Eat, son. She's got a good heart." Eliza met the old man's eyes, startled. "You know him?" Abel smiled weakly. "Tazi. Met him years back, when I was preaching among the tribes. He gave me safe passage once. God sent him again, I reckon." Tazi looked down, almost embarrassed by the praise. Eliza folded her hands in her lap, the wood chair creaking. The fire painted them all in gold and shadow. For a moment, she forgot the years of silence, the whispers from town, the ache that had hollowed her out. There were voices in her house again. Warmth. Breath. Life. But fear soon returned. "They can't stay," she told herself silently. The town would burn the place down. Yet she could not bring herself to say the words aloud. When Abel finally drifted into sleep, Eliza rose to check the shutters once more. The wind had softened. Snow still fell, but slower now, like feathers. Behind her, she heard Tazi murmur something in his language, a tone low and reverent, almost like a prayer. "What did you say?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Thank you for letting us live." She turned toward him. The firelight caught his face, strong, scarred, and unbearably human. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the faint tremor of something she thought was gone. The will to be seen. Outside, the storm moaned over the hills, sweeping through pines and hollows. Inside, 3 hearts beat in uncertain rhythm, stitched together by accident and need. Eliza sat by the fire, watching the stranger's silhouette against the orange glow, the old man's hand resting faintly on his knee. She thought of her husband, of the empty years, of the snow that never seemed to stop falling. Maybe, she wondered, some storms didn't come to destroy, only to bring the lost to one another. A sudden crack of wind shook the door. In the brief flicker of lamplight, she saw the shadow of something outside, movement, or perhaps just the storm's trickery. She rose slowly, heart pounding, and reached for the latch. When she opened the door, the wind roared through, and the world beyond was nothing but white and silence. Except for one thing. Fresh footprints in the snow. Not leaving. Arriving. The fire hissed softly as melting snow dripped from the stranger's blanket onto the floorboards. The small cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and fear. Eliza sat in her chair, shawl wrapped tight, watching the man from the edge of lamplight. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm, each breath sounding more like endurance than rest. Beside him the old man, Abel Carter, lay beneath quilts, his face pale as candle wax. For the first time in years, there were 3 heartbeats inside her home. The storm outside had quieted, but it left behind a silence so deep it seemed to listen. Eliza stirred the pot on the hearth, adding the last of her salt. The spoon trembled in her hand. "He should be dead," she said, half to herself. The stranger's eyes lifted, dark, unafraid. "He lives." His voice was rough but steady, carrying an accent shaped by wind and hunger. He sat cross-legged on the floor, shirtless, skin bronzed and scarred, hair bound loosely by a strip of leather. Firelight painted his muscles in amber tones, turning his stillness into something carved rather than born. Eliza turned away, uneasy with her own fascination. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. "I didn't choose the storm," he replied. The words lingered. She poured water into a tin cup and offered it to him. He hesitated before taking it, careful not to let his fingers touch hers. Steam rose between them like breath. Abel stirred and coughed. His eyes opened slowly, clouded with age yet glinting with mischief that winter had not stolen. "You two look like ghosts afraid of each other," he rasped. "Sit closer. The Lord didn't light that fire for distance." Eliza managed a faint smile, more from habit than comfort. She fetched another blanket and draped it over the old man's shoulders. "You shouldn't have come through that pass," she said. "Not this time of year." "I didn't walk," Abel murmured. "He carried me." His weak hand gestured toward the Apache. "Said he owed me his life." The stranger said nothing. His gaze drifted to the window, where snow still fell in soft sheets. Eliza sank into her chair. "You're Tazzy," she said slowly, recalling the name from Abel's faint whispers earlier. "Is that right?" He nodded once. "I've heard stories," she said before she could stop herself. "Most stories," he answered, "are told by those who never meet the people they tell them about." She fell silent. The wind pressed against the walls like a listening ear. When Abel slept again, Eliza rose to fix the door latch. The blizzard had loosened it, and every gust made the wood groan. Tazzy joined her without a word, kneeling beside the frame. His hands were large, scarred, and sure. He worked the hinge back into place using the edge of his knife, moving with quiet precision. "You don't have to." He glanced at her. "Cold gets in through small cracks." She couldn't argue with that. Together they steadied the door until the wind was nothing but a muffled hum. When it was done, he stepped back, eyes catching hers briefly. Gratitude hung unspoken between them, heavy as the smell of burning wood. That night, they ate in near silence. Abel mumbled a blessing that dissolved halfway through. Tazzy took only a small portion, as if afraid to take too much from her. Eliza watched the flames instead of him, tracing the dance of shadows on the log walls. Afterward, she washed the bowls while he tended the fire. The rhythm of their movements filled the room like cautious conversation. At last she said, "When this storm ends, you'll need to leave before the townsmen come looking. They'll think the worst." He poked at the fire with an iron rod. "Let them think. You don't understand. They'll hurt you." He turned, his expression unreadable. "They already have." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She saw, for the first time, the old burn marks along his ribs, long, cruel, the kind made by rope and hatred. She looked away, ashamed again. Not of him, but of the world she came from. "I didn't mean." "I know." He said it gently, as if forgiving her for a sin she hadn't confessed. Later, when Abel began coughing again, Eliza knelt beside the bed. The old man's eyes fluttered open. "Don't send him away," he whispered. "A soul don't survive alone, girl. Learned that too late myself." She brushed the damp hair from his forehead. "Rest now." But his words clung to her as she moved about the room, banking the fire, tidying, pretending not to notice the quiet presence watching her from the hearth. She found herself studying the details of him. The way his breath misted in the lamplight, the faint tremor in his hands from exhaustion. She tried to picture the life he'd lived before that night and couldn't. Her world and his felt carved from opposite sides of the same silence. When the clock struck midnight, Abel slept soundly. Tazzy rose, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "I'll go," he said. "Morning light." "You can't," she replied, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. "The roads are buried. You'd die out there." He smiled faintly, a ghost of defiance. "Then I die free." Something inside her cracked. The same old stubborn peace that had kept her alive through winters of grief. "You'd leave him?" she asked softly, nodding toward Abel. The smile vanished. "I gave him back once. I will again." Eliza stared at him, the words catching in her throat. She didn't know what she meant to say. Thank you or stay, or I understand, but none of them felt safe. He bowed his head slightly. "You're afraid," he said. "I'm careful." "Fear and care are brothers," he murmured. "But only one keeps you warm." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind eased. She couldn't tell if the warmth spreading through her chest came from his words or from the flames. At dawn, gray light bled through the window. The storm had softened to a whisper. Tazzy gathered his things, a knife, the torn blanket, and stood by the door. "You'll freeze," she said. He met her eyes. "Better than being unwanted." She wanted to argue, but before she could, Abel stirred again, coughing blood. Panic snapped through the room. She rushed to the bedside, pressing cloth to his lips. "Pa, stay with me." Tazzy dropped his blanket, knelt beside them. He steadied Abel's head, his voice calm as stone. "Breathe, old one." When the coughing eased, Abel gripped his wrist weakly. "Don't leave her," he whispered. "The house needs sound again." Tazzy didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward Eliza, and she saw something there that silenced her fear. He rose, set another log on the fire, and quietly began to boil water. By evening, Abel slept easy. Tazzy remained by the hearth, mending the torn edge of her curtain with careful stitches. Eliza watched from the table, fingers trembling around her cup. The old house felt changed somehow, less hollow, less hers alone. She whispered, "You could stay until the thaw." He didn't look up. "Then we'll see." The fire burned lower. Outside, the wind carried a new sound. Not the cry of winter, but the distant echo of hooves. Eliza turned toward the window, her heart tightening. "Someone's coming." Tazzy's hand froze mid-stitch. He set the needle down slowly. "Then the storm isn't over after all." By the time the thaw began, the cabin's roof had bowed under the weight of weeks of snow, but inside there was warmth. Eliza had almost forgotten what laughter sounded like until Abel began humming hymns again, his frail voice trembling but alive. Tazzy kept the fire fed, patched walls, and cut wood with the quiet patience of a man who knew what storms could do to a soul. The silence between him and Eliza had softened into something unspoken, a steady rhythm that felt almost like peace. Yet peace in the hills rarely stayed long. It began with smoke. A traveler on the ridge saw the chimney breathing again and told the town. By the next morning, the gossip spread like a brush fire through dry grass. Widow Carter's light was seen burning late, they said. Someone tall, an Indian maybe, was living under her roof. Mrs. Lang was first to speak it aloud in the mercantile, voice sweet as poison. "A woman alone is one thing, but taking in a savage? Lord preserve us." When Eliza rode into town that week, her mule's hooves clopped across muddy ruts slick with melting snow. Eyes followed her from porches and windows. She could feel the judgment before hearing it. Every greeting was sharp-edged, every silence louder than words. Sheriff Branson stood outside his office, arms folded, watching her tie the mule at the hitching post. "Morning, widow," he said, hat low over his brow. "Sheriff." Her voice was calm, though her stomach twisted. "You've had company up there. I found my father-in-law half dead in the storm. He's alive because of that man." "The Apache." "The man," she corrected. The sheriff's jaw flexed. "You know how this looks, Eliza. Folks don't forget easy. I stopped caring what they think a long time ago." "Maybe you should start again," he said, softer now. "You're stirring ghosts best left buried." She stared past him at the church steeple, its bell glinting weakly in the sun. "Ghosts have a way of finding the living, Sheriff." He sighed. "Then keep your door locked. For your sake." Inside the general store, the whispers grew teeth. Mrs. Lang's tongue worked faster than her hands as she weighed sugar. "Can't imagine what your husband would think," she said with a saccharine smile. "Rest his soul." Eliza lifted her chin. "He'd think I did right keeping his father alive." "And the Indian? He's the reason any of us are breathing." Mrs. Lang tittered. "That may be, dear. But you'll find gratitude don't buy forgiveness." Eliza placed her coins on the counter with trembling fingers, and left before the tears could come. The road home was quiet except for the creak of the saddle, and the river's thawing groan. She stopped once, staring at her reflection in the water, older than she remembered, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. But beneath the weariness there was something else, defiance, faint but growing. When she reached the cabin, the smell of stew drifted through the open window. Abel sat in the rocker, wrapped in blankets, smiling when he saw her. "Town still small as ever?" "Smaller," she said, hanging her shawl by the fire. "Feels like it's shrinking around its own hate." Tazzy looked up from the table, where he was carving a new handle for her axe. "Hate is cold," he said. "It needs walls to keep warm." She met his gaze, startled by the gentleness in it. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it felt like something more than speech, like truth worn smooth by pain. The days passed quietly. Tazzy repaired the barn roof, dug out the path to the well, and built a new cross over the grave of Eliza's husband. When she saw it, simple and clean in the snow, she pressed her hand to her mouth. "You didn't have to." He looked away. "He's part of you. So he's part of here." Something fragile in her chest shifted, like a locked door creaking open. That night, she found herself humming while she cooked, an old tune her mother had sung. Tazzy listened from the corner, head bowed, and Abel smiled with closed eyes. For a few hours, the world outside felt far away. But peace never lasted long in a place that refused to forgive. One evening, hoofbeats thundered through the valley. Eliza stepped onto the porch to see 3 men riding hard up the hill, faces she knew too well. Joseph Kent, her late husband's cousin, led them, his coat collar pulled high, his voice rough with whiskey. "Eliza!" he shouted before dismounting. "You in there?" She tightened her shawl, heart pounding. "What's this about?" He spat in the snow. "We came to see that half-naked heathen you're shacking up with." Before she could answer, Tazzy stepped into the doorway behind her. The lantern's glow painted him in amber and shadow, bare-chested, calm, unarmed. His eyes never left the men. "You ought to ride back down," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm. Joseph sneered. "Or what? You'll set your pet on us." Tazzy's voice was low, steady. "I don't fight men who fear what they don't understand." The insult hit harder than a bullet. Joseph took a step forward, hand hovering near his revolver. "You calling me afraid?" Abel's frail voice broke the tension. "Joseph Kent, I baptized you when you were 10, he called from inside. "Don't you dare raise that gun in my house." The wind hissed through the trees. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Joseph's gaze faltered. He turned his head and spat again, but softer this time. "You'll regret this, Eliza," he muttered. "You and your Indian." The men mounted their horses and rode away, hooves beating a rhythm that lingered in her chest long after they vanished. Inside, the fire crackled. Eliza sank into her chair, trembling. "They'll come again," she whispered. Tazzy looked toward the window. "Then they'll find kindness is harder to kill than fear." Abel chuckled weakly from his bed. "Hear that, girl? God sends angels in all colors." Eliza smiled despite herself. "He doesn't look much like an angel." "Most don't," Abel said. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the moon carve silver lines across the snow. Tazzy was outside, splitting logs. His breath rose in misty curls, his body a dark silhouette against the pale world. Each strike of the axe echoed like a heartbeat in the frozen air. When he came in, she poured him coffee, her hands brushing his as she passed the cup. "You shouldn't have gone out there," she murmured. "They'll think you're daring them." He shook his head. "I was only making fire." She smiled faintly. "You do that well." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something neither dared name. Days stretched into weeks. The town grew colder toward her. Doors didn't open when she passed. Voices hushed. But she found she cared less with each sunrise. The cabin, once her tomb, had become something else. Alive again. Abel's strength waned. He spoke often of forgiveness now, as though trying to plant the word before his time ran out. "People talk about sin," he told her one night. "But the worst sin I ever knew was turning your back on mercy." When she brought him water, he caught her hand. "That man's got mercy in him, girl. Don't let the world shame you out of seeing it." Later, as she banked the fire, she caught sight of Tazzy kneeling by the hearth, head bowed in quiet prayer. His lips moved, and though she didn't know the words, the rhythm of them filled her chest with calm. The next morning, she rode down to town again, not for supplies but to face them. As she dismounted outside the store, conversation stopped cold. Mrs. Lang stared openly from the doorway. Eliza met every eye and said, steady as the river thaw, "If kindness is shame, I'll wear it proud." Then she turned and walked back to her mule, leaving behind a silence no one could break. By the time she returned to the cabin, the snow had begun again, soft flakes swirling like ghosts over the ridge. She saw smoke curling from the chimney, and felt the ache in her chest ease. Inside, Abel was sleeping. Tazzy stood by the window, looking out at the white horizon. He turned to her slowly. "The town came." "They'll come again," she said. He nodded. "Then we wait." Outside, the snow thickened, erasing every track that led to the cabin, as if the world itself meant to keep their secret safe. But as night fell, faint hoofbeats echoed once more, closer this time, carrying voices that did not sound like mercy. The storm returned without warning, sweeping through the valley like a vengeance long delayed. Snow fell in sheets so thick that the sky itself disappeared, and the world shrank to the size of the small cabin crouched beneath the hills. Inside, the fire burned low, its light trembling across 3 faces. Abel's breath rattled shallowly. Each rise of his chest seemed borrowed from grace rather than strength. Eliza sat beside him, her hand clutching his, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Tazzy stood near the window, the storm reflected in his dark eyes. "They'll come," he murmured. Eliza didn't look up. "Let them freeze on the way." He said nothing, but the weight in his gaze told her he believed otherwise. Fear had a way of finding warmth to destroy. The town would not forget humiliation, nor forgive what they could not name. Abel stirred, his voice faint as the wind beyond the glass. "Child!" He swallowed hard, his hand trembling in hers. "If they come, if I go before they do, promise me you'll act like your family." Her eyes filled. "Pa, don't." He smiled, a small curve of peace amid the pain. "Ain't blood that keeps a soul alive. It's love, and the choice to stand when you could run." He looked toward Tazzy then, his expression turning to quiet pride. "You keep her safe, son. God don't care what color his mercy wears." Before dawn, Abel Carter took his last breath. The fire cracked once, as if marking the moment. Eliza sat frozen, fingers still wrapped around his cooling hand. Outside, the snow roared like the sea. Tazzy moved to her side, kneeling silently. For a long while there were no words, only the sound of wind and grief breathing together. Then she rose and fetched a blanket, tucking it gently around the old man's shoulders, as if he merely slept. "We'll bury him near the well," she whispered. "He always said the ground there was good." Tazzy nodded. "The snow's deep. But we'll make the earth remember him." They worked through the gray morning, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The world was silent except for the dull rhythm of shovels breaking frozen soil. When the grave was ready, Tazzy carried Abel's body himself, slow, reverent, strong as stone. Eliza followed with the lantern, its light barely pushing back the storm. When they laid the old man down, Eliza whispered the prayer her husband had once said at funerals. Her voice cracked on the last line, and Tazzy reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with a thumb roughened by labor. It was the first time he touched her without hesitation. The snow began to cover the fresh mound before they reached the door again. Inside, Eliza collapsed by the fire. "He was the last piece of my life," she said, voice hollow. Tazzy crouched beside her. No. He was the bridge to your next one. She looked at him, startled. You speak like a preacher. I listened to one, he said simply, glancing toward the bed. For a while, they sat in silence, bound by the fragile thread of shared loss. But peace never held long in that valley. Before noon, the sound of horses shattered the stillness. Eliza's head snapped toward the window. No. Tazzy rose, muscles tensing. Stay here. Through the swirling white, shadows moved. 3, then 4 riders, their coats dark against the snow. Joseph Kent again, and others from town. Guns slung low. Their voices were muffled but hard. Widow Carter. Joseph called, his tone mocking. We came to pay our respects, and clean out what don't belong. Tazzy opened the door before she could stop him. Snow burst in, fierce and cold. He stepped onto the porch, bare-chested beneath his blanket, the wind curling around him like a living thing. You should go home, he said. Joseph laughed. Home? While a savage squats in my cousin's bed. I don't think so. Behind him, the men shifted, uneasy under his fury. Eliza stepped forward, clutching her father-in-law's Bible to her chest. You'll show respect, she said, her voice trembling. He saved Abel's life. Saved mine. Joseph sneered. Then he can join him in the ground. Tazzy's eyes narrowed. You won't cross that line. Or what? Or the snow will remember your name longer than your kin will. The threat was quiet, but it carried. The wind dropped for a moment, the whole valley holding its breath. Joseph's hand twitched toward his gun. Don't test me, Redskin. Before steel cleared the holster, Eliza stepped between them. You'll have to shoot through me first. The words stunned even her. The men faltered. Her hair whipped across her face, her cheeks flushed from cold and rage. This man carried my father through a storm, fixed my roof, dug my husband's grave, and built me a cross when no one else would. She lifted the Bible high, her voice breaking like thunder. If that ain't family, then none of you know what the word means. No one moved. Snow hissed around them, soft but endless. Finally, the sheriff's horse appeared through the white haze. Branson rode up slow, his face hard as iron. Enough! He barked. His gaze moved from Eliza to Tazzy, then to Joseph. No blood'll be spilled on this mountain today. She's lost her mind, Sheriff, Joseph spat. Living with that. Branson cut him off with a glare. I don't give a damn what you think. I see a man standing over a grave he dug with his bare hands. I see a woman who's buried half her life and still ain't quit. He turned his horse. Go home, Kent. Before this storm decides to bury you too. Joseph's mouth twisted, but he backed down, fury clutched tight in his jaw. The men followed, vanishing into the white. When they were gone, Eliza sagged, her knees nearly buckling. Tazzy caught her before she fell. She leaned into him, her forehead brushing his chest. The warmth of him was startling after so much cold. I didn't mean to speak like that, she whispered. Yes, you did. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder. And you meant every word. She looked up at him, and for the first time he smiled. A small, weary curve that melted something deep inside her. That night, the storm died. The world lay still and silver, wrapped in quiet. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed bright again. 2 bowls of stew steamed on the table. Abel's chair sat empty, but not lonely. Eliza reached across the table, fingers brushing Tazzy's. You could stay till spring, she said softly. He nodded. If you want family, he murmured. You already have it. The wind sighed through the cracks in the walls, not like a warning this time, but a benediction. Outside, the fresh snow shone pale under the moonlight. Footprints led from the grave to the door, 2 sets now, side by side. And as the narrator's memory faded into that silent landscape, the voice of the old soul returned, low and warm. They say she took in a stranger that winter. But those who truly watched knew better. The storm didn't bring ruin, it brought her home. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the bell of the town church tolled once, faint and distant, as if even it had found a reason to forgive.